For 40 years, Japan had known nothing but victory, steadily expanding its empire across Asia. Yet by 1937, Tokyo was no longer planning its next triumph. It was fighting to avoid collapse. The economy depended on resources the home islands could not supply. The military was draining money into a Manchurian occupation that refused to pay for itself. And across China, rivals who had spent years fighting each other were now uniting against a common enemy. On July 7th of that year, shots rang out near a bridge outside Beijing. Within weeks, two nations were locked in a war that would eventually claim 20 million lives and become the largest Asian confrontation of the 20th century. Japanese forces swept through coastal cities, capturing Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing within months, expecting China to surrender after losing its capital. Instead, the government fled westward and kept fighting for 8 years across territory larger than Western Europe, consuming resources Japan could not spare and soldiers it could not replace. Most accounts frame this as military aggression meeting resistance, but that explanation misses something crucial, because by 1937, 4 pressures had been closing around Japan for decades. Each expansion Tokyo had undertaken demanded further expansion to protect what had already been gained, and each success planted the seeds of the next crisis. This is how Japan's leaders built that trap, starting with the triumph that changed everything. Section 1. The Road to Invasion. In 1894, Japan defied the expectations of the entire world when it engaged China in armed conflict and won decisively. At that time, China was considered the sleeping giant of Asia, since it had the largest population on Earth with more than 400 million people. It had the oldest continuous civilization in human history, stretching back thousands of years, and its government commanded vast territories that stretched from the frozen borders of Mongolia to the tropical regions near Vietnam. On paper, China's forces looked far more powerful than anything the small island nation of Japan could possibly raise against them. Japan, by contrast, was an island chain with a population size about 40 million at that time, which was roughly 1/10 the size of China. For centuries, Japan had been isolated from the rest of the world, cut off from foreign influence by its rulers. Given these facts, it seemed impossible that such a small nation could defeat the ancient giant of Asia. Yet Japan had something China lacked, and that advantage would prove critical in the conflict to come. Japan had a modern force built on European models because over the previous 3 decades, the country had transformed itself from an isolated feudal society into an industrial nation. This transformation began with the Meiji Restoration of 1868, since before that year, Japan had been ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate, a feudal government that had deliberately kept the country isolated for over 250 years. In 1868, a group of reformers restored the Japanese emperor to power and launched an ambitious program of modernization that touched every aspect of society. The reformers sent students to study in Europe and America, and they hired foreign experts to build factories, railways, and shipyards. They reformed the government, the economy, and most importantly, the armed forces. Japanese officers studied at academies in Germany and France, where they learned the latest tactics and strategies. Japanese ships were built in British shipyards or constructed with British technical assistance, and the country invested heavily in modern weapons, purchasing the latest rifles, artillery, and naval vessels. By 1894, Japan possessed one of the most effective armed forces in Asia, equipped with weapons and tactics that matched European standards. Meanwhile, China had also attempted modernization during this period, since the Qing dynasty launched what they called the self-strengthening movement, which involved building arsenals, shipyards, and modern warships. But China's reforms were slower and less thorough than Japan's because the vast size of the country made coordinated change difficult. Corruption siphoned off resources at every level, and regional officials often ignored orders from Beijing. By 1894, China's forces remained a patchwork of modernized and traditional units, without unified command or consistent equipment across different regions. Then, the conflict began over Korea, which both countries claimed influence over, and the results would shock observers around the world. Korea had been a tributary state of China for centuries, paying symbolic tribute to the Chinese emperor while maintaining its own government. Japan saw Korea as a potential gateway to the Asian mainland and as a strategic buffer against potential enemies. When a rebellion broke out in Korea in 1894, both China and Japan sent troops to restore order, and neither would back down from their positions. Japanese troops landed at Incheon in the summer of 1894 and quickly pushed north while Chinese forces retreated in confusion. In just 9 months, Japanese forces swept through Chinese defenses with stunning ease, and battle after battle ended the same way. Japanese troops, who were well-trained and well-equipped, overwhelmed Chinese defenders who often lacked ammunition, coordination, or clear orders from their commanders. At sea, the results were equally devastating for China. The Chinese Beiyang fleet was considered the most powerful naval force in Asia at that time, and it included 2 German-built battleships that were the largest warships in Asia. When this fleet met the Japanese combined fleet at the Battle of the Yalu River on September 17, 1894, most observers expected a close fight between the two forces. Instead, Japanese tactics and gunnery proved far superior to what China could field against them. Japanese ships moved in disciplined formations, while their gunners fired with remarkable accuracy, and Chinese ships struggled to coordinate their movements in response. The crews, though brave in the face of danger, had not trained together as intensively as the Japanese had. By the end of the day, most of China's modern warships had been destroyed or captured, which meant Japan now controlled the Yellow Sea and could land troops wherever it chose along the Chinese coast. With command of the sea secured, Japan struck at the heart of Chinese defenses by invading the Liaodong Peninsula in southern Manchuria. Port Arthur, a strategic fortress that controlled access to the region, fell after a brief siege. By early 1895, Japanese troops had also captured the Chinese naval base at Weihai Wei, where the remaining Chinese fleet was destroyed. With these victories secured, the approaches to Beijing itself lay open to the advancing forces, and China had no choice but to sue for peace. The Treaty of Shimonoseki was signed on April 17, 1895, at a hotel in the Japanese port city of the same name. The negotiations had been tense and humiliating for China, and the Chinese negotiator Li Hongjiang was a seasoned diplomat who understood exactly how devastating the terms would be for his country. But he had no leverage to improve them, since China had lost the conflict completely. The terms were devastating for China and transformative for Japan's position in Asia. Under the treaty, China was forced to recognize Korea as fully independent, which really meant opening the door for Japanese influence over the peninsula. China also handed over Taiwan and the Penghu Islands to Japan permanently, and these became Japan's first formal colonies. Additionally, China surrendered the Liaodong Peninsula, including the valuable Port Arthur with its excellent harbor. Finally, China agreed to pay Japan a staggering sum equivalent to several years of Chinese government revenue, which was larger than Japan's entire annual budget at the time. The victory was total, and Japan had announced itself as a modern power on the world stage. European governments that had dismissed Japan as a backward island nation now took notice of its capabilities. Back home, Japanese leaders celebrated what they saw as proof of their nation's strength, and in this moment of triumph, a dangerous confidence was born. This confidence was a belief that Japanese determination and discipline could overcome any obstacle, no matter how large. But Japan's celebration was about to be cut short by forces beyond its control. Just 6 days after the treaty was signed, 3 European powers intervened in the situation. Russia, Germany, and France issued what became known as the Triple Intervention, and they demanded that Japan give back the Liaodong Peninsula to China. Their stated reason was concern for peace in the region, but their real reason was self-interest. Russia had its own plans for that peninsula and its warm water ports. Germany was looking for opportunities to expand its influence in Asia, and France supported its ally Russia in the matter. Japan was forced to back down from its gains, since the country simply could not stand against three major European powers at once. Russia alone had forces that dwarfed Japan's capabilities, and in exchange for surrendering the peninsula, Japan received an additional payment from China. But no amount of money could erase the humiliation that Japanese leaders felt over this forced retreat. What happened next made the insult even worse for Japan. Within months, the very same Russia that had forced Japan out of the Liaodong Peninsula moved in itself. Russia secured a lease on Port Arthur from the weakened Chinese government and began building railways to connect the port to Russian territory. The strategic position that Japan had won with sacrifice was now in Russian hands, and Japanese leaders never forgot this humiliation. For the next decade, they prepared for the day when they would settle the score with Russia. By 1904, Japan was ready for its chance at revenge against Russia. Tensions between Japan and Russia had been building for years, since both nations wanted control of Manchuria and influence over Korea. For years, Russia had been expanding its presence in the Far East by building railways, establishing businesses, and stationing troops in the region. The Trans-Siberian Railway was nearing completion, which would allow Russia to move forces to the region more quickly than ever before. Japanese leaders attempted to negotiate a settlement with Russia, and they proposed dividing influence so that Japan would recognize Russian interests in Manchuria if Russia would recognize Japanese interests in Korea. But Russian leaders refused to make meaningful concessions in the negotiations because they believed that no Asian nation would dare to challenge a European great power. This was a fatal miscalculation on their part, since Japanese leaders concluded that waiting longer would only make the situation worse. Every month of delay worked against Japan's interests, and the time for diplomacy had passed. On February 8, 1904, Japan launched a surprise strike on the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur, and the result overturned decades of assumptions about power in Asia. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation decisively defeated a European great power. At that time, Russia was considered one of the mightiest empires on Earth, with the largest standing force in the world consisting of over 1 million men under arms. Its vast territory stretched from Europe across Siberia to the Pacific, while Japan, by comparison, was a small island nation with a fraction of Russia's population and resources. Given this disparity, few serious observers expected Japan to prevail in the conflict. Yet Japan's forces proved devastatingly effective in engagement after engagement. The battles that followed were brutal and costly for both sides, but Japan continued to advance. In May 1904, Japanese forces crossed the Yalu River and pushed into Manchuria, and that September they won a significant victory at the Battle of Liaoyang, forcing the Russians to retreat northward. Then, in January 1905, after a months-long siege that cost tens of thousands of lives, Port Arthur finally fell to Japanese forces. By March 1905, Japan had captured Mukden, the Manchurian capital, after weeks of intense fighting that left over 70,000 soldiers from both sides among the casualties. But the most devastating blow came at sea, in a battle that would become one of the most lopsided naval engagements in history. Russia's Baltic fleet had sailed over 7 months and more than 18,000 nautical miles from European waters to reinforce its Pacific forces. The voyage was a nightmare of mechanical breakdowns, supply problems, and crew exhaustion, and by the time the fleet arrived, the sailors were worn out from their long journey. On May 27, 1905, this worn-out fleet met the Japanese combined fleet in the Tsushima Strait between Japan and Korea, and what followed was a complete disaster for Russia. The Japanese destroyed or captured virtually every Russian ship in the engagement. Of the 38 Russian vessels that entered the battle, 21 were sunk, 7 were captured, and 6 were interned in neutral ports, which meant only 3 escaped to reach Russian ports. In a single afternoon, the Russian fleet essentially ceased to exist as a fighting force, and with its Pacific fleet destroyed, Russia had no choice but to seek peace with Japan. Then, U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt offered to mediate between the two sides, and negotiations began at Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The Treaty of Portsmouth was signed on September 5, 1905, and under the agreement, Russia recognized Japan's dominant position in Korea, which Japan would formally take control of in 1910. Russia also handed over its lease on the Liaodong Peninsula, including Port Arthur, which was the very territory that Japan had been forced to surrender a decade earlier. Additionally, Russia gave Japan control of the South Manchuria Railway and its associated mining rights, along with the southern half of Sakhalin Island. The psychological impact of this victory cannot be overstated, but it also contained a dangerous seed that would grow in the years ahead. Japan had defeated a European great power, and for the first time, the assumption that European nations were inherently superior to Asian ones had been shattered. The victory electrified nationalists across Asia, and it also confirmed Japanese leaders in their belief that determination and discipline could overcome material disadvantages in any conflict. But this belief contained a dangerous element that few recognized at the time. The reality was that Japan had been exhausted by the conflict with Russia since the national treasury was nearly empty. Foreign debts had mounted rapidly to pay for expensive modern weapons and supplies, and if the fighting had continued much longer, Japan might not have been able to sustain the effort. Japanese forces in Manchuria faced ever longer supply lines, while Russia could continue to build up reinforcements via the Trans-Siberian Railway. At home, many Japanese felt cheated by the Treaty of Portsmouth because it did not include cash payments from Russia, and riots broke out in Tokyo as a result. The public had expected a crushing victory to produce crushing terms, but what they did not understand was how close Japan had come to the limits of its resources. This disconnect between Japan's actual capabilities and its population's expectations would grow more dangerous over the coming decades, since each victory reinforced myths about Japanese invincibility, and each success made leaders more confident in their own judgment. Now Japan controlled the South Manchuria Railway, a steel thread running through the richest part of China. Japan's victory over Russia opened the door to Korea, since under the Treaty of Portsmouth, Russia had recognized Japan's dominant position on the peninsula. Within 5 years, Japan would transform that influence into outright control, and the process happened in stages, with each step making the next one seem necessary. In November 1905, Japan forced Korea to sign the Ulsa Treaty, which made Korea a Japanese protectorate. Under this arrangement, Japan took control of Korea's foreign relations, and a Japanese resident general was appointed to oversee the country. The Korean emperor protested against these terms, but his objections were ignored by the international community at large. Over the next several years, Japan steadily expanded its control until complete annexation became inevitable. Japanese advisors were placed throughout the Korean government, and Korean resistance movements were suppressed by force. When the Korean emperor tried to appeal to the international community at the Hague Peace Conference in 1907, Japan forced him to abdicate in favor of his son. By 1910, Japan was ready for the final step in its takeover, and on August 22nd of that year, the Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty was signed. Korea officially became part of the Japanese Empire, and it would remain under Japanese control for the next 35 years. With Korea secure, Japan now had a gateway to the Asian mainland. The annexation gave Japan direct access to the resources and strategic position it had long sought, since Korea provided agricultural land and labor. More importantly, it provided a bridge to Manchuria and the vast territories beyond, which meant Japan's sphere of influence now extended from its home islands across the Sea of Japan and deep into the Asian continent. But controlling Korea also created new responsibilities that would prove difficult to manage. Japan now had to maintain order on the peninsula, and it had to invest in infrastructure and administration. It had to defend against potential threats from Russia to the north and China to the west, which meant the conquest that was supposed to enhance Japan's security had actually expanded its commitments and vulnerabilities. This pattern would repeat itself again and again in the years ahead, since each territorial gain created new problems that seemed to require further gains to solve. For 2 decades after taking Korea, Japan expanded its influence in Manchuria slowly and carefully through economic rather than military means. Japanese investment poured into the region through the South Manchuria Railway Company, which was far more than just a railroad. It operated mines, factories, ports, and even towns along its route. And by the late 1920s, the company had become one of the largest enterprises in Asia, employing tens of thousands of workers and controlling vast resources. Japan worked through local strongmen to maintain stability without the costs of direct rule. The most important of these partners was Zhang Zuolin, a former bandit who had risen to become the dominant warlord in Manchuria. Zhang cooperated with Japanese interests in exchange for support, and he allowed Japanese businesses to operate freely while protecting the South Manchuria Railway. The arrangement seemed to benefit both parties for many years, but by the late 1920s, this system was breaking down, and Japanese officers were growing increasingly frustrated with the situation. Zhang Zuolin had begun opening Manchuria to investment from Britain and America, threatening Japan's exclusive position in the region. Worse still, his son Zhang Xueliang was aligning with the Chinese nationalist government, and Japanese officers watched these developments with growing alarm. On June 4, 1928, Zhang Zuolin was eliminated when a device placed by Japanese officers from the Kwantung Army exploded beneath his train. The plotters hoped his removal would create chaos that Japan could exploit, but instead, his son Zhang Xueliang took control and moved to align Manchuria with China. On December 29, 1928, Zhang Xueliang formally recognized the authority of the nationalist government, and for the first time in over a decade, China was nominally unified under a single government. Japanese officers in Manchuria grew increasingly frustrated with this development, since their government in Tokyo seemed unwilling to act decisively. Many believed that if Japan waited too long, the opportunity to secure Manchuria would be lost forever, and these officers began planning in secret without telling their own government what they intended to do. On September 18, 1931, they made their move, and the incident they staged would change the course of history. Japanese officers staged what became known as the Mukden incident by placing explosives near the South Manchuria Railway and detonating them. A small section of rail was destroyed, but a train passed over the spot shortly afterward with no difficulty, since the damage was so minor that it would not have stopped a single train. But the officers blamed the explosion on Chinese forces anyway, and this fabricated incident gave them the excuse they needed to take action. Within hours, Japanese forces were moving across Manchuria, and the government in Tokyo found itself presented with a situation that officers on the ground had created. The officers had started an invasion that the civilian leadership had not authorized, but rather than order a withdrawal, Tokyo accepted what had already happened. Within months, Japanese forces had conquered the entire region, an area larger than France and Germany combined. By 1932, Japan had established Manchukuo, a puppet state with the last emperor of China's Qing dynasty installed as its figurehead ruler. The international community was outraged, but powerless to stop what had already occurred. The League of Nations condemned the action and refused to recognize Manchukuo as a legitimate state, but Japan simply withdrew from the League and continued with its plans. Western powers issued protests, but took no meaningful action to reverse the situation, and the lesson was clear. Japan could act with impunity as long as it did not directly threaten Western interests in the region. Yet the conquest of Manchuria did not solve Japan's problems, and in many ways, it made them worse. The territory required defending against Chinese resistance movements that never stopped fighting against Japanese occupation. It required developing with enormous investments in infrastructure, since building mines, railways, factories, and ports demanded capital and materials that Japan did not have in abundance. The project consumed more than it produced, which meant the conquest that was supposed to make Japan self-sufficient had instead increased its dependency on outside materials. By 1937, all four of Japan's traps had reached their breaking points at the same moment. The resource trap meant Japan needed to expand or watch its economy strangle from lack of materials. The Manchurian trap meant Japan had to protect its investment or lose everything it had gained over the previous years. The growing independence of the armed forces meant that officers on the ground would make decisions that Tokyo could not control. And China's increasing unity meant that every month of delay made the situation more dangerous for Japan. What happened over the following years would devastate both nations and reshape the entire world. But the seeds of that catastrophe had been planted long before that summer night in 1937. They had been planted with each victory, each conquest, and each decision that seemed logical at the time, but led inevitably toward disaster. Section 2. The Four Traps. Japan's path from its first victory over China in 1895 to the seizure of Manchuria in 1931 followed a dangerous pattern. Each conquest created new problems that seemed to require even more expansion to solve. By 1937, four traps had closed around the country, and understanding these pressures is essential to understanding why war came when it did. Each trap operated on its own terms, but together they left the leadership in Tokyo with fewer and fewer options as the months passed. These four traps were not random accidents of history. They grew from decisions made by Japanese leaders over the preceding decades, decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but created consequences that their makers never anticipated. Again, each trap reinforced the others, creating a web of pressures that pushed Japan toward expansion, even when many of its leaders would have preferred a different path. And knowing such pressures are essential to understanding everything that followed. Let us begin with the most basic problem of all, which was the question of where Japan would find the raw materials it needed to survive as a modern industrial nation. The resource trap. Japan's home islands were beautiful, with mountains, forests, and coastlines that inspired poets and artists for centuries. But beneath that beauty lay a harsh economic reality. The islands contained almost nothing useful for running a modern industrial economy. There were no significant oil reserves anywhere in Japan. Iron ore deposits were minimal and of poor quality, while coal existed in limited quantities, but not nearly enough to power a major industrial nation. The country also lacked rubber, tin, copper, bauxite, and dozens of other materials that modern industry required. This scarcity had not mattered much when Japan was an isolated agricultural society under the Tokugawa shoguns. Rice paddies, fishing grounds, and silk production had sustained the population adequately for centuries. But when Japan opened to the world after 1853 and began to industrialize following the Meiji Restoration of 1868, everything changed. Factories needed coal to power their machines, shipyards needed steel to build vessels, and arsenals needed raw materials to manufacture weapons. The more Japan industrialized, the more it depended on importing these critical materials from foreign countries. By the 1930s, this dependency had become genuinely dangerous because the countries that supplied Japan's essential materials were increasingly hostile to Japanese ambitions. Consider the numbers, which tell a stark story of vulnerability. Japan imported over 90% of its petroleum from overseas sources, and a large portion of that oil came from the United States. American oil fields in California and Texas produced far more than the domestic market could absorb, and Japan had become one of the largest customers for this surplus. But the United States was also Japan's most likely adversary in the Pacific region, since both countries had competing interests in China and Southeast Asia. If relations between the two countries deteriorated, America could cut off Japan's oil supply with a single stroke of the pen. The situation with iron and steel was equally precarious. Japan's domestic steel industry had grown rapidly since the opening of the Yawata Iron and Steel Works in 1901, but it depended heavily on imported raw materials. By 1939, more than 50% of Japan's scrap metal was imported, and the United States supplied nearly 99% of those imports. Japanese factories melted down American scrap to produce the steel that built Japanese ships, tanks, and artillery pieces. If America stopped selling scrap metal, Japan's entire defense industry would grind to a halt within months. Beyond oil and steel, Japan depended on foreign sources for dozens of other critical materials. Rubber came from British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, both colonies of potential enemies. Tin came from the same regions. Bauxite for aluminum production had to be imported. Even rice, the staple food of the Japanese diet, had to be brought in from abroad to feed a population that had grown beyond what the home islands could sustain. Japan's population had expanded from about 30 million at the time of the Meiji Restoration to nearly 65 million by 1930, and it continued to grow each year. The resource trap thus created a terrible dilemma for Japanese planners because every path forward seemed blocked by the same basic obstacle. If Japan wanted to remain a great power, it needed a strong industrial base. A strong industrial base required steady supplies of oil, iron, rubber, and other raw materials. But if Japan depended on foreign powers for these materials, then those foreign powers could strangle Japan's economy whenever they chose to do so. The country's very survival as an industrial nation rested on the goodwill of potential enemies, and that goodwill could be withdrawn at any moment for any reason. The only way to escape this dependency was to control territories that contained the resources Japan needed. But seizing such territories would anger the very powers that Japan currently depended upon for supplies. It was a classic trap with no easy escape. Do nothing and remain vulnerable to economic pressure. Act aggressively and risk provoking the very confrontation you hope to avoid. Japanese planners debated these alternatives throughout the 1930s, but none of them could find a solution that avoided both dangers. The Great Depression that began in 1929 made this problem even worse for Japan. When the global economy collapsed, Western nations raised tariffs and closed their markets to protect their own industries. Britain established imperial preference, favoring trade within the British Empire over trade with outside countries. France did the same with its colonies. America maintained high tariffs that had been established during the 1920s. Japan's export trade suffered badly, which made it harder to earn the foreign currency needed to pay for essential imports. Within the leadership circles in Tokyo, voices began arguing that only expansion could solve Japan's economic problems, and these voices grew louder as the 1930s progressed. These voices pointed to the European colonial powers, who controlled vast territories rich in the very resources Japan needed. The Dutch East Indies, which included the islands of Java, Sumatra, and Borneo, possessed enormous oil reserves that could make Japan energy independent for decades. British Malaya controlled much of the world's rubber production, along with significant tin deposits. French Indochina provided rice and other agricultural products. The Western powers had carved up Asia to serve their own economic interests, and now they were using trade barriers and embargoes to keep Japan in a subordinate position. The argument posed the question, why should Japan accept rules that had been designed to keep it weak? The Europeans had built their empires through conquest, yet they now lectured Japan about respecting the territorial integrity of nations. They had taken what they wanted when they were strong enough to do so, and now they expected Japan to accept permanent inferiority. This argument resonated powerfully with many Japanese officers and politicians, especially those who felt that Japan deserved recognition as an equal among the great powers. The lesson of the League of Nations reinforced this view. When Japan seized Manchuria in 1931, the League condemned the action and refused to recognize the puppet state of Manchukuo. But the League did nothing to reverse Japan's gains. There were no effective sanctions, no armed intervention, no real consequences beyond diplomatic protests. Japan simply withdrew from the League in 1933 and continued with its plans. They believed that if the international system would not enforce its rules, why should they obey them? Put it simply, the resource crisis was not merely an economic problem. It was an existential threat that shaped every aspect of Japanese strategic thinking. Without oil, the Navy could not sail. Without iron, the factories could not produce. Without rubber, the vehicles could not roll. Japan's position as a great power rested on a foundation of imported materials that could be cut off at any moment by the very nations Japan might someday have to fight. This vulnerability haunted Japanese planners and drove them toward increasingly desperate solutions. The resource trap was not just about economics. It was about survival itself. And that made compromise seem impossible. This drive for resources led directly to the second force, the Manchurian trap. When Japanese officers from the Kwantung Army staged the Mukden incident in September 1931 and seized Manchuria, they believed they were solving Japan's resource problems once and for all. Manchuria was vast, covering roughly 800,000 square kilometers, which was nearly twice the size of France and Germany combined. The region contained rich deposits of coal and iron ore, exactly the materials Japan needed to fuel its industrial economy. It also had fertile agricultural land that could help feed Japan's growing population, and it bordered both the Soviet Union and China, giving it enormous strategic importance. Japanese planners envisioned transforming Manchuria into an industrial powerhouse that would free Japan from dependence on Western imports. They would extract the region's coal and iron ore, build factories to process these raw materials into steel and manufactured goods, and create a self-sufficient economic zone that no foreign power could threaten. The South Manchuria Railway Company, which Japan had controlled since 1905, would be expanded into a comprehensive industrial empire covering mining, manufacturing, transportation, and urban development. Instead of solving Japan's problems, however, Manchuria created a new set of difficulties that proved even more challenging than the original ones. The first problem was development. Manchuria's resources existed, but extracting and processing them required enormous investments in infrastructure. The region was largely undeveloped, with few roads, limited railways outside the South Manchuria Railway Zone, and almost no modern industrial facilities. Japan needed to build mines to extract coal and iron ore. It needed to construct smelters and steel mills to process these materials. It needed to lay railways to transport goods and build ports to ship them. It needed to create entire cities from scratch to house the workers who would operate all these facilities. All of this required capital that Japan did not have in abundance. The country was still recovering from the Great Depression, and its government finances were strained by the costs of maintaining armed forces throughout the region. Worse still, the construction projects themselves required materials like steel and machinery that Japan still needed to import. In a painful irony, the conquest that was supposed to make Japan self-sufficient actually increased its need for foreign materials in the short term. Japan had to spend resources to develop resources, with no guarantee that the investment would ever pay off. The second problem was defense. Because Manchuria's geography created vulnerabilities that required constant vigilance. Manchuria shared a long border with the Soviet Union, which maintained powerful forces in Siberia and viewed Japanese expansion with deep suspicion. The Soviets had built the Trans-Siberian Railway, which could move troops and supplies to the Far East more quickly than Japan could reinforce Manchuria by sea. Border clashes between Japanese and Soviet forces occurred periodically throughout the 1930s, and Japanese planners had to assume that a major Soviet offensive was always possible. Defending against this threat required stationing large forces in Manchuria permanently, which consumed resources that might otherwise have been used for development. The Japanese forces in Manchuria needed to be supplied with food, ammunition, fuel, and equipment. Soldiers required pay, and officers expected the comforts appropriate to their rank. All of this had to be shipped from Japan, or produced locally at great expense. The Kwantung Army grew from a small garrison force into one of the largest and best-equipped formations in the Japanese order of battle, but it was consuming resources rather than generating them. The territory that was supposed to provide resources was instead demanding them. The third problem was resistance, because the Chinese population of Manchuria never accepted Japanese control. Although Japan established the puppet state of Manchukuo in 1932 and installed Puyi, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, as its figurehead ruler, the approximately 30 million Chinese who lived in the region had not been consulted about this arrangement. Many of them resented foreign control and were willing to resist it through various means. Resistance movements sprang up throughout the territory, conducting operations against Japanese troops, sabotaging infrastructure, and making the occupation costly and difficult. The local population had no intention of accepting Japanese rule quietly. Japan responded with harsh measures to suppress this resistance, but the resistance could not be eliminated through force alone. New fighters emerged to replace those who were captured or removed from the field. The rural population often supported the resistance movements, providing food, shelter, and information to those who opposed the occupation. Japan had to maintain constant vigilance throughout Manchuria, deploying troops and police forces across the vast territory to keep order. This further drained the resources that were supposed to be flowing the other way. By the mid-1930s, the Manchurian project was consuming far more than it produced. Japan had poured enormous sums into developing the region, but the expected returns had not materialized on schedule. The puppet government of Manchukuo could not function without constant Japanese support and subsidies. The industrial development program was behind schedule and over budget. Meanwhile, the international community refused to recognize Manchukuo as a legitimate state, which limited Japan's ability to trade with other nations and attract foreign investment. The Manchuria trap thus locked Japan into a position from which it could not easily escape, because walking away would mean admitting failure. Having invested so much in the territory, Japan's leadership felt they could not simply abandon the project. Giving up Manchuria would mean writing off years of investment and acknowledging that the policy had been a mistake from the beginning. It would mean accepting that the officers who had staged the Mukden incident had led the country into a dead end. It would mean returning to the vulnerable position Japan had occupied before 1931, dependent on foreign powers for essential resources. For all of these reasons, retreat seemed impossible, even as the costs of staying continued to mount. Worse still, the logic of the situation seemed to demand further expansion rather than retreat. If Manchuria's resources were not sufficient to make Japan self-reliant, then perhaps Japan needed to control additional territories as well. If Chinese resistance continued to drain Japanese strength, then perhaps Japan needed to weaken China itself by seizing more of its territory. If the Western powers refused to accept Japan's position in Manchuria, then perhaps Japan needed to become so powerful that their acceptance no longer mattered. Each of these arguments pushed toward more expansion, not less, even as the costs of expansion continued to mount. By 1935, Japanese pressure on northern China was increasing. The Kwantung Army began demanding that Chinese forces withdraw from the provinces of Hebei and Chahar, creating buffer zones between China proper and Manchukuo. Japanese-sponsored autonomous movements appeared in these regions, attempting to detach them from Nanjing's control. The same pattern that had begun in Manchuria Manchuria was spreading southward, driven by the same logic of protecting investments and securing resources. Each step forward created new problems that seemed to require yet another step forward to solve. The Kwantung Army had developed ambitious plans for northern China. They wanted to create an additional puppet state modeled on Manchukuo that would serve as a buffer zone protecting their original conquest. This region would also provide additional resources and markets that Manchuria alone could not supply. The army's planners believed that if they could secure northern China, the entire project might finally become economically viable. But such expansion would require confrontation with Chinese forces and would almost certainly provoke international condemnation. Nevertheless, the pressure to expand continued to mount as the costs of the existing occupation continued to rise. The Manchuria trap thus created a dangerous momentum that pushed Japan toward ever greater involvement in China, regardless of what the civilian government wanted. Yet even as economic pressures mounted, a third force was making the situation even more dangerous: the breakdown of command structure, the military trap. The third trap was perhaps the most dangerous of all, because it meant that the civilian government in Tokyo was losing control over the decisions that would determine Japan's future. Since the Meiji Restoration of 1868, the Japanese armed forces had developed a culture of independence from civilian oversight that created serious problems as the 20th century progressed. Understanding how this happened requires examining the peculiar structure of the Japanese constitution and the traditions that had grown up around it. The Meiji Constitution of 1889 placed the armed forces directly under the emperor, not the cabinet. The emperor was the supreme commander of the army and navy, and military matters were reported to him directly rather than through the prime minister. This arrangement was supposed to keep the armed forces above the dirty business of politics, but it also meant that officers could claim they were following imperial will, even when they defied government policy. A clever officer could always argue that his actions served the emperor's interests, even if the prime minister and cabinet disagreed. By the 1930s, this constitutional ambiguity had evolved into something far more dangerous: a culture of insubordination that celebrated officers who took unauthorized action. The Kwantung Army, which was stationed in Manchuria to protect Japan's interests along the South Manchuria Railway, had become particularly resistant to orders from Tokyo. Officers in this force believed they understood the situation on the ground better than politicians and bureaucrats hundreds of miles away. They were convinced that aggressive action was necessary to protect Japan's interests, and they were willing to act without authorization if they believed the civilian government was being too cautious or too slow. The removal of warlord Zhang Zuolin in 1928 demonstrated this pattern clearly. Zhang had been Japan's partner in Manchuria for years, cooperating with Japanese interests in exchange for support against his rivals. But by the late 1920s, he had begun opening Manchuria to investment from Britain and America, threatening Japan's exclusive position in the region. Officers from the Kwantung Army decided that Zhang needed to be eliminated, and they planted explosives under his train without seeking approval from Tokyo. The incident succeeded in removing Zhang from the scene, but his son Zhang Shuiliang took control and moved to align Manchuria even more closely with China. Prime Minister Tanaka Giichi wanted to punish the officers responsible for this unauthorized action, but he faced fierce resistance from the armed forces. The officers argued that they had acted from patriotic motives to protect Japan's interests. Many in the military establishment supported this view and opposed any punishment. In the end, no court-martial was held, and the officers faced no serious consequences. Tanaka himself was forced to resign within a year, partly because of his handling of the incident. The lesson was clear and dangerous. Officers who acted boldly from patriotic motives would be protected, even if they violated orders and created diplomatic crises. This lesson was reinforced dramatically by the events of September 1931, when Kwantung Army officers staged the Mukden incident and began seizing Manchuria. The government in Tokyo was completely surprised. Some ministers wanted to order a withdrawal and punish the officers responsible, but they faced opposition from the armed forces and from public opinion, which celebrated the bold action. The government ultimately chose to accept the fait accompli and send reinforcements to support the unauthorized operation. The officers who had staged the incident were rewarded with promotions rather than punishments. Colonel Itagaki Seishiro and Lieutenant Colonel Ishiwara Kanji, the main planners of the Mukden incident, both rose to high positions in the following years. The message could not have been clearer. Successful insubordination would be embraced rather than condemned. If you acted boldly and succeeded, you would be celebrated as a hero. If you failed, you might face criticism, but you would not face serious punishment as long as you could claim you had acted from patriotic motives. Throughout the early 1930s, this culture of direct action spread throughout the Japanese armed forces and into civilian politics as well. Young officers who believed the government was corrupt, weak, or insufficiently committed to national glory formed secret societies and plotted dramatic action. They believed that bold strokes could cut through the paralysis of democratic politics and restore Japan to its proper path. Many were influenced by ultranationalist ideologies that celebrated sacrifice, purity of motive, and contempt for material considerations. The violence reached a terrible peak in the early 1930s as political eliminations became an accepted tool of change in some circles. In 1932, a group of naval officers carried out what became known as the May 15th Incident, targeting Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi because he had attempted to restrain the armed forces in Manchuria. Inukai lost his life in this incident, along with several other officials. The perpetrators received relatively light sentences because the court recognized their patriotic motivations and sincere intentions. This leniency sent another clear message. Even the most extreme actions would be treated with understanding if they were motivated by love of country. The violence peaked with the February 26th incident of 1936. On that date, about 1,400 troops from the Army's elite 1st Infantry Division seized key government buildings in Tokyo and targeted several senior officials. Finance Minister Takahashi Korekiyo, Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal Saito Makoto, and Inspector General of Military Education Watanabe Jotaro all lost their lives in the violence. Prime Minister Okada Keisuke narrowly escaped when the insurgents mistakenly targeted his brother-in-law instead. The rebels held central Tokyo for several days before the emperor personally intervened to order their suppression. The February 26th incident was eventually suppressed, and this time the ringleaders faced serious consequences, including capital punishment for the main conspirators. But the underlying culture that had produced the incident remained intact. After 1936, civilian politicians were even more reluctant to challenge the armed forces, knowing that doing so might cost them their lives. The government that emerged from the crisis included more military officers in key positions and was more accommodating to military demands. The constitutional mechanism that had previously allowed some balance between civilian and military power had broken down. By 1937, the Japanese government had largely lost the ability to restrain its own armed forces, which meant that a single incident could spiral into full-scale conflict before anyone could stop it. Commanders in the field could start incidents, demand reinforcements, and force the government to support operations it had never authorized. The government in Tokyo might officially be in charge, but the initiative had passed to officers on the ground who were willing to act first and seek approval later. These officers genuinely believed they were serving Japan's interests, but their actions were pushing the country toward conflicts that wiser heads might have avoided. The Japanese concept of Geckokujo, which roughly translates as subordinates overruling their superiors, had deep roots in Japanese history. In feudal times, samurai retainers sometimes took actions that their lords could not publicly authorize but would privately approve. This tradition had been adapted to modern military circumstances, creating a culture where junior officers felt justified in taking initiative even when their superiors had not given explicit permission. The problem was that in an age of instant communications and international consequences, such freelancing could create disasters that affected the entire nation. The military trap was perhaps the most dangerous of all because it meant that no one was truly in control of Japan's destiny. While these internal pressures were building inside Japan, a fourth force was emerging across the sea: the transformation of China itself, the China Trap. This fourth trap was created by changes within China itself that threatened to close the window of Japanese opportunity. For decades, Japan had benefited from China's weakness and division. The fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911 had plunged China into chaos, with regional warlords controlling different parts of the country and constantly fighting among themselves. The central government, whether in Beijing or later in Nanjing, controlled only a portion of the country and had to devote much of its energy to internal rivals rather than external enemies. This divided China had been unable to resist Japanese encroachment effectively. When Japan seized Manchuria in 1931, the Chinese government protested to the League of Nations but could not mount effective resistance on the ground. Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader, was more concerned with defeating his communist rivals than with confronting Japan. He famously compared Japan to a disease of the skin while calling communism a disease of the heart, indicating that he considered the internal threat more urgent than the external one. By the mid-1930s, however, China was beginning to change in ways that threatened Japan's comfortable position. The most visible change was the modernization of China's armed forces with German assistance. Beginning in the late 1920s, German officers had been advising the Chinese government on military matters. This cooperation benefited both sides. Germany needed access to Chinese raw materials like tungsten and antimony for its rearmament program, while China needed military expertise to build a modern army. The relationship deepened significantly after 1933, when General Hans von Seeckt arrived in China. Seeckt was one of the most respected military minds of his generation. He had been the architect of Germany's own military rebuilding after the First Great Conflict, transforming the small Reichswehr into the foundation for later expansion. Now he brought his expertise to China, developing a comprehensive plan to transform the Chinese forces. He served as Chiang Kai-shek's chief military advisor from 1933 to 1935, and after his departure, General Alexander von Falkenhausen continued the work from 1935 to 1938. Seeckt's plan called for creating 60 modern divisions trained in German methods and equipped with German-style weapons. These would not be mass armies of poorly trained peasants, but professional formations capable of standing against any opponent. The plan was ambitious, and China's limited industrial capacity meant that progress would be slow. But by 1937, about 20 of these German-trained divisions were combat-ready or close to it. They were equipped with modern rifles, machine guns, and artillery. Their officers had been trained in German tactical methods. They represented a genuine fighting force that could not be dismissed. The German advisors brought more than just training methods to China. They helped establish an industrial base capable of producing modern weapons domestically. Chinese factories began manufacturing copies of German rifles and machine guns. New arsenals were built to produce ammunition and artillery shells. Fortifications were constructed at strategic locations following German engineering principles. A major loan of 100 million Reichsmarks was arranged in 1936 under a barter agreement, with China exchanging raw materials for German industrial equipment and weapons. When full-scale conflict with Japan finally came in 1937, German officers were present at the front lines, wearing Chinese uniforms and providing tactical guidance that surprised Japanese commanders. The German involvement in China was so extensive that some Japanese officers later referred to the fighting at Shanghai in 1937 as the German War. The Chinese troops they faced there were trained in German methods, equipped with German-style weapons, and advised by German officers. The fierce resistance at Shanghai, which lasted far longer than Japan expected, was partly a product of this German influence. What had seemed like an easy opponent was transforming into a serious challenge. The Sino-German cooperation extended beyond military matters. Germany needed Chinese raw materials, particularly tungsten and antimony, for its rearmament program. China needed industrial equipment and weapons that Germany could provide. The relationship was mutually beneficial and growing stronger each year. By 1937, dozens of German military advisors were working throughout China, and German industrial experts were helping to establish new factories and infrastructure. This cooperation would continue until Germany pressured its advisors to leave in 1938, after Japan demanded that Germany choose between its Asian partners. Even more alarming from Japan's perspective was the growing unity among China's previously divided factions. Since 1927, the nationalists and communists had been locked in a bitter civil struggle. Chiang Kai-shek had devoted enormous resources to elimination campaigns against the communist forces, driving them from their bases in southern China and nearly destroying them during the Long March of 1934 to 1935. By 1936, the communist forces were confined to a small area in the northwest around Yan'an and seemed to pose little immediate threat to the nationalist government. Chiang appeared close to achieving his goal of unifying China under nationalist control. But Japanese aggression was creating pressures that pushed the two sides toward cooperation. The communist leadership had been calling for a united front against Japan since 1935, and this appeal resonated with many Chinese who were frustrated by the continuing civil struggle while foreign troops occupied Chinese territory. Student protests in Beijing in December 1935 demanded that the government stop fighting the communists and unite against Japan. Similar sentiments spread throughout the country, creating a groundswell of nationalist feeling that Chiang could not ignore. Regional commanders who had been neutral or aligned with Nanjing began questioning the priorities of the central government. Zhang Shuiliang, who had once ruled Manchuria before the Japanese invasion, burned with desire to reclaim his homeland. He had been given command of forces tasked with continuing the campaign against the communists, but he resented fighting other Chinese while Japanese troops occupied his native region. Yang Hucheng, another general in the northwest, shared these frustrations. Both men had been in secret contact with the communist leadership, exploring possibilities for cooperation against Japan. The turning point came in December 1936 with the Xi'an incident, which transformed Chinese politics virtually overnight. Chiang Kai-shek flew to the city of Xi'an to meet with Zhang Shuiliang and Yang Hucheng, intending to push them to continue operations against the communists. Instead, the two generals seized Chiang and held him captive. For 2 weeks, from December 12th to December 25th, 1936, the fate of China hung in the balance. Some voices called for Chiang to face trial for his failures to resist Japan. The communist leadership initially celebrated his capture, seeing an opportunity to eliminate their chief enemy. But cooler heads prevailed. Zhou Enlai, one of the top communist leaders, traveled to Xi'an to participate in negotiations for Chiang's release. The Soviet Union, which feared Japanese expansion more than it wanted communist victory in China, pressured the Chinese communists to seek a peaceful resolution. After intense discussions, Chiang agreed to end the civil struggle and form a second united front with the communists to resist Japanese aggression. On December 25, 1936, he was released and returned to Nanjing. The Xi'an incident transformed the strategic situation in East Asia. Before December 1936, Japan could exploit China's internal divisions, playing different factions against each other and absorbing territory piece by piece. After December 1936, China was moving toward unity against its common enemy. The Communist Red Forces were reorganized as the 8th Route and new 4th Armies, nominally placed under nationalist command. Regional warlords who had stayed on the sidelines began aligning with the central government. By July 1937, China had achieved a level of unity not seen since the fall of the Qing dynasty. For Japanese planners, this development was deeply troubling. Every month that passed allowed China to grow stronger. More divisions were trained, more factories were built, more regions were brought under central control. The divided, weak China that Japan had easily exploited for decades was disappearing, being replaced by a nation that might soon be able to resist effectively. If Japan was going to act, it needed to act soon, before the window of opportunity closed entirely. The China trap was perhaps the most urgent of all four pressures because it was time-sensitive in a way the others were not. The resource shortage was chronic, the Manchurian investment was sunk, and the erosion of civilian control was an ongoing condition. But China's transformation was accelerating, and each month made the situation worse from Japan's perspective. This sense of urgency, combined with the pressures from the other three traps, created an explosive mix that needed only a spark to ignite. Now that we understand the four traps individually, we need to see how they developed over time and how they interacted with each other to create the crisis of 1937. None of these pressures emerged suddenly or unexpectedly. They built up gradually over years and decades, with each development making the next step seem more necessary. The leaders who made the key decisions often believed they were acting wisely and cautiously, yet their choices created consequences that pushed Japan ever closer to catastrophe. What makes this history so tragic is that many of the individual decisions seemed reasonable at the time they were made. Seizing Manchuria seemed like a solution to Japan's resource problems. Rewarding bold officers seemed like a way to encourage initiative and decisive action. Building up the armed forces seemed like a prudent response to an uncertain world. Each choice made sense in isolation, but together they created a system that was racing toward disaster. Looking back, we can see the patterns clearly, but at the time, even thoughtful leaders struggled to perceive the full scope of the problem. By tracing this progression, we can understand how Japan's leaders found themselves in a position where armed conflict appeared to be the only remaining option. For a nation trying to become a world power, this was more than an inconvenience. It was an existential threat, the deepening resource crisis. Japan's resource dependency had been a concern since the country began industrializing in the late 19th century, but the problem became acute during the 1920s and 1930s. The Japanese economy had grown dramatically during the First Great Conflict, when European powers were too busy fighting each other to compete for Asian markets. Japanese exports boomed, and the country developed its industrial capacity at a remarkable pace. Textile mills, steelworks, and shipyards expanded rapidly to meet demand from allied nations. But this growth created an ever-increasing appetite for raw materials that the home islands could not provide. The Japanese industry needed more coal, more iron, more oil with each passing year. The infrastructure that had been built during the boom years required continuous inputs of raw materials to keep operating. Japan had industrialized successfully, but it had done so in a way that made it permanently dependent on foreign suppliers. The more the economy grew, the greater this dependency became. The situation became critical when the Great Depression struck in 1929 because it exposed just how vulnerable Japan's position really was. World trade collapsed as countries everywhere raised tariffs to protect their own industries. Japan's exports fell sharply, making it harder to earn the foreign currency needed to pay for imports. The silk industry, which had been one of Japan's main export earners, was devastated as American consumers cut back on luxury purchases. The collapse in export earnings meant that Japan could afford fewer imports, but its industrial economy still required the same raw materials to function. The British Empire tightened its trade barriers against Japanese goods, particularly textiles. The Ottawa Conference of 1932 established imperial preference, giving favorable trade terms to goods produced within the British Empire while raising barriers against outside competitors. France did the same with its colonial empire. America maintained high tariffs that had been established during the 1920s and also restricted Asian immigration through racist policies. Japan found its access to foreign markets restricted at the very moment when it most needed export earnings to pay for essential imports. Japanese planners watched these developments with growing alarm. They saw a world where the great powers had divided up the globe's resources among themselves and were determined to keep Japan out. The Western colonial empires controlled most of the world's supply of oil, rubber, tin, and other critical materials. These empires had been built through conquest and maintained through military power. Yet now the Western powers lectured Japan about respecting international law and the territorial integrity of weaker nations. Within Japan, economists and strategic thinkers began developing theories about how to escape this trap through the creation of a self-sufficient economic bloc. A concept that would later be called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere emerged from these discussions. The basic idea was to bring together Japan, Manchuria, China, and eventually Southeast Asia into an integrated economic system under Japanese leadership. Such a system would provide all the resources Japan needed while creating markets for Japanese manufactured goods. It would free Japan from dependence on the Western powers and provide security against economic pressure. Sanji Ishihara, one of the officers who planned the Mukden incident, had developed detailed theories about total conflict between nations based on his studies in Germany. He concluded that to survive a prolonged struggle, Japan needed to establish economic self-sufficiency by controlling enough territory to produce all necessary resources. Manchuria was supposed to be the first step in this program, providing coal, iron, and agricultural products. But when Manchuria failed to provide the expected resources quickly enough, the logic of Ishihara's theory pointed toward further expansion rather than a reconsideration of the basic premise. By 1936 and 1937, Japan's resource situation was becoming more precarious with each passing month. The armed forces were expanding rapidly to meet the demands of operations in China, consuming ever larger quantities of oil, steel, and other materials. The construction projects in Manchuria continued to drain resources without yet producing the expected returns, and American policy was becoming increasingly hostile, with growing calls in Washington to restrict exports to Japan as punishment for its aggression in Asia. The Export Control Act, which would come in July 1940, was already being discussed. This legislation would eventually restrict the sale of aviation fuel and high-grade scrap iron to Japan. By July 1941, the situation would become even more dire when America, Britain, and the Netherlands froze Japanese assets and imposed a total oil embargo. Japan's 6-month oil reserve created genuine urgency. The country had to either secure alternative supplies or watch its military and industrial capabilities wither away. The oil situation was particularly critical for the Japanese Navy. Modern warships consumed enormous quantities of fuel, and Japan's fleet was one of the largest and most powerful in the entire world. Naval planners calculated that if oil imports were cut off, the fleet would have to remain in port within 18 months. After that, there would not be enough fuel to maintain operational readiness, let alone conduct major operations. This timeline created intense pressure to secure alternative oil sources before existing stocks ran out entirely. The resource crisis was not something that could be solved through diplomacy or patience. It required action, and the clock was ticking, and so Japan acted. In 1931, officers from the Kwantung Army staged an explosion on a railway line in Manchuria, blamed it on the Chinese, and used it as justification to seize the entire region. Overnight, Japan had gained a territory rich in coal, iron, and farmland, the solution to all their problems, or so they thought. Instead, this became a weight around the country's neck that dragged it deeper into crisis. The Manchurian quagmire. When the Kwantung Army officers staged the Mukden incident on September 18, 1931, they acted against the express wishes of the civilian government in Tokyo. The cabinet had not authorized any military action in Manchuria, and when news of the incident reached the capital, there was genuine confusion about how to respond. Some officials wanted to order an immediate withdrawal and punish the officers responsible for this flagrant insubordination. Others argued that Japan should accept the situation and make the best of it. In the end, the government chose the path of least resistance, setting a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the 1930s. Rather than ordering a withdrawal, the cabinet sent reinforcements to support the unauthorized operation. This decision reflected several factors: fear of confrontation with the armed forces, public enthusiasm for the conquest and a sense that the opportunity should not be wasted. Whatever the reasons, the result was that the government followed the military rather than leading it. The civilian authorities had demonstrated that they would accept fate's accomplice rather than challenging them, and officers throughout the armed forces took note. Within months, Japanese forces had conquered all of Manchuria. The speed of the conquest surprised even its planners, as Chinese resistance proved far weaker than expected. In March 1932, Japan established the puppet state of Manchukuo with Puyi, the last Qing emperor, as its nominal ruler. The new state was supposedly independent, but everyone understood that real power lay with the Kwantung Army. The army's commanding officer could override any decision by Puyi's government and effectively functioned as the territory's true ruler. The international reaction was swift, but ultimately ineffective. The League of Nations sent a commission of inquiry headed by Lord Lytton, which spent months investigating the situation. The resulting Lytton report, published in October 1932, concluded that Japan's actions could not be justified as self-defense and that Manchukuo was not a genuine expression of local self-determination. The report labeled the Mukden incident as a staged provocation, not a legitimate act of self-defense. The League adopted the report and refused to recognize the puppet state. There were no effective sanctions, no armed intervention, no real consequences beyond diplomatic protests and condemnations. Japan's response to international criticism was simply to leave the organization that had criticized it. In March 1933, Japan announced its withdrawal from the League of Nations, effective in 2 years. The withdrawal was greeted with enthusiasm in Japan, where many people felt that the League was a tool of Western imperialism that applied different standards to Asian and European nations. Japan would go its own way, following its own interests without regard for the opinions of the Western powers. This defiant stance was popular at home, but left Japan increasingly isolated internationally. Meanwhile, the actual project of developing Manchuria proved far more difficult than the planners had anticipated. The region's climate was harsh, with bitterly cold winters that made construction difficult for several months each year. Infrastructure had to be built almost from scratch in many areas. The local population, who had not been consulted about becoming subjects of a Japanese puppet state, proved uncooperative when they were not actively resistant. Skilled workers had to be brought in from Japan, adding to the costs. By the mid-1930s, it was becoming clear that Manchuria would not quickly solve Japan's resource problems. Development projects were consuming enormous amounts of capital without yet producing the expected returns. The Kwantung Army, which had to maintain order against resistance movements and defend against potential Soviet intervention, was a constant drain on resources. The puppet government required ongoing subsidies to function. Far from becoming a source of wealth for Japan, Manchuria was becoming a sink that absorbed resources without a clear end. The sunk cost fallacy began to dominate thinking about Manchuria. Japan had invested so much in the region that abandoning it seemed unthinkable, even as the costs continued to mount. Each new investment was justified by the need to protect previous investments. Each failure to meet targets was explained by the need for more resources and more time. The project took on a momentum of its own that was difficult to stop, even as the original goals receded further into the future. The human cost of the Manchurian occupation was also mounting. Japanese settlers had been encouraged to move to Manchuria with promises of land and opportunity, but they found conditions far harsher than expected. The climate was brutal, the local population was hostile, and the promised prosperity failed to materialize. Meanwhile, the Chinese resistance continued despite all efforts to suppress it, requiring a constant military presence that drained resources and manpower from other priorities. The Manchurian quagmire demonstrated one solid truth. Conquest was easy, but consolidation was hard, and the costs of occupation could exceed the costs of invasion many times over. But here is what made this situation truly dangerous. The officers who created the Manchurian mess in the first place were never punished. In fact, they were promoted, and that sent a message throughout the Japanese military. Act first, ask permission later, and Tokyo will follow along. By the mid-1930s, men who were supposed to be giving orders had lost control of the men who were supposed to be following them. This led to the erosion of civilian control. Culture of military insubordination that would prove so dangerous in 1937 developed gradually over the preceding decade through a series of incidents that progressively weakened civilian authority. Each incident established new precedents that made the next act of insubordination easier to justify. By the time the crisis came at Marco Polo Bridge, patterns were so well established that escalation was almost automatic. The sequence began in 1928 with the removal of Zhang Zuolin, which established the precedent that officers could take dramatic, unauthorized action without facing serious consequences. When the Kwantung Army officers who had carried out the operation escaped punishment, the message was clear. Patriotic motives could excuse even the most serious violations of discipline. Failure to hold anyone accountable emboldened other officers who believed that bold action was needed to advance Japan's interests. If one group of conspirators could get away with unauthorized action, why couldn't others do the same? The Mukden incident of 1931 reinforced these lessons on a much larger scale. When the Kwantung Army seized all of Manchuria without authorization, the government in Tokyo had a clear choice. It could reassert civilian control by ordering a withdrawal and punishing the officers responsible, or it could accept the fait accompli. By choosing acceptance, the government effectively surrendered its authority over military operations in China. Officers throughout the armed forces understood that successful insubordination would be rewarded rather than punished. The pattern continued with the first Shanghai incident of January 1932. Japanese forces engaged Chinese troops in Shanghai without clear authorization from Tokyo, forcing the government to send reinforcements and negotiate a ceasefire that preserved Japanese interests. Once again, officers on the ground had created a situation that the civilian leadership had no choice but to accept. The boundaries between authorized and unauthorized action were becoming increasingly blurred. As the 1930s progressed, the violence increasingly turned inward, targeting Japanese political leaders who were seen as obstacles to national greatness. The removal of Prime Minister Inukai in 1932 was a watershed moment. Inukai had attempted to restrain the armed forces and maintain civilian control over military operations. For this, he paid with his life. The officers who carried out the action received relatively light sentences because the court recognized their patriotic motivations. The judicial system itself had become complicit in the erosion of civilian authority, signaling that violence against politicians would be treated leniently if the perpetrators claimed to be acting for Japan's benefit. After 1932, no prime minister could afford to challenge the armed forces too directly. The threat hung over anyone who moved too aggressively against military interests. Cabinet ministers learned to accommodate military demands rather than oppose them. The emperor himself, who had the constitutional authority to restrain the armed forces, chose not to exercise that authority directly, preferring to work through intermediaries. The result was a government that could not govern, a civilian leadership that had lost the ability to lead. February 26th incident of 1936 represented both the peak of military radicalism and the beginning of its containment. The uprising was suppressed, and the ringleaders faced capital punishment. But the victory for civilian control was more apparent than real. The government that emerged from the crisis was even more accommodating to military demands than its predecessors. The threat of another uprising remained, and politicians remained cautious about confronting the armed forces. Fundamental dynamic had not changed. Officers in the field could create situations that Tokyo had to accept. The aftermath of the February 26th incident reshaped Japanese politics in profound ways. Military officers were appointed to key cabinet positions at a rate never seen before. The budget for the armed forces increased dramatically, consuming an ever larger share of national resources. Peace advocates and liberal politicians found themselves marginalized, their voices drowned out by calls for national unity and military preparedness. The democratic institutions that had developed during the 1920s were being hollowed out from within, replaced by a system that gave the armed forces effective veto power over national policy. The erosion of civilian control was not a single event, but a gradual process that transformed Japanese governance over the course of a decade. But there was one more trap closing in, and in some ways, it was the most urgent of all. Because China was no longer the weak, divided nation Japan had pushed around for 40 years. China was transforming, and the window of opportunity was closing fast. This was the beginning of China's transformation. The changes in China during the 1930s represented perhaps the most important factor pushing Japan toward conflict. For years, Japan had benefited from Chinese weakness and division. A strong, unified China would be a completely different challenge, one that many Japanese leaders doubted their country could overcome. As China moved toward unity and modernization, the pressure to act before the window closed became increasingly intense. The transformation began with the German military mission, which brought professional expertise to the Chinese armed forces for the first time. German officers who arrived in China starting in the late 1920s were not ordinary military advisors. Many of them had served in the First Great Conflict and had experienced modern combined arms combat firsthand. They brought with them the lessons learned from 4 years of brutal fighting in Europe. Lessons that they now transmitted to their Chinese students. General Max Bauer arrived first, followed by others of increasing seniority. Hans von Zeigt himself, who arrived in 1933, had been responsible for rebuilding the German military after the First Great Conflict and was one of the most respected military minds of his generation. Zeigt's plan for China was ambitious, but realistic. He understood that China could not quickly build an army to match Japan's in numbers or equipment. Instead, he focused on creating an elite corps of modern divisions that could serve as the foundation for future expansion. These divisions would be trained to German standards, equipped with modern weapons, and led by officers who understood contemporary combat. They would not be able to defeat Japan alone, but they would be able to resist effectively and buy time for China to develop further. The results were visible by 1937. About 20 Chinese divisions had been trained and equipped to German standards. They were not quite up to the level of the Japanese Army's best formations, but they were far superior to anything China had fielded before. More importantly, they represented a foundation on which further development could build. Every month that passed allowed more Chinese officers to complete training programs, more Chinese factories to produce weapons and ammunition, more Chinese infrastructure to support military operations. Political transformation was equally dramatic, as the Xi'an incident forced a realignment of Chinese politics. When Zhang Xueliang and Yang Hucheng seized Chiang Kai-shek in December 1936, they forced a resolution to the question that had paralyzed Chinese politics for years. Should China continue fighting its civil struggle or unite against Japan? The answer, imposed by the circumstances of Chiang's captivity, was unity. The second united front that emerged from Xi'an was fragile and would eventually collapse, but in the short term, it transformed China's strategic position. Before the Xi'an incident, China was divided and distracted. After the incident, China was moving toward unity. Communist forces, which had been the target of elimination campaigns for nearly a decade, were now reorganized as part of the national military structure. The Red Army became the 8th Route Army and the new 4th Army, placed under nominal nationalist command. Regional warlords who had remained neutral or played both sides now aligned with the central government. The Chinese people, who had been demoralized by years of internal conflict and foreign encroachment, found new purpose in the call to resist aggression. By July 1937, China was more unified than it had been at any point since the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911. The change was remarkable. Just 6 months earlier, Chiang Kai-shek had been planning yet another campaign against the communists. Now he was leading a united front that included his former enemies. The window of opportunity that Japanese planners had counted on was closing rapidly. If they waited much longer, they might face a China that could actually resist. The psychological impact of the Xi'an incident was as important as its political consequences. For years, Chinese nationalism had been divided between anti-Japanese sentiment and anti-communist ideology. The Xi'an incident resolved this tension in favor of national unity. Across China, people celebrated the formation of the United Front. Students who had protested for resistance against Japan now felt that their voices had been heard. A new sense of purpose was emerging, one that would sustain Chinese resistance through years of brutal conflict. Japanese intelligence officers watched these developments with growing concern and alarm. Their reports to Tokyo emphasized the rapid changes taking place in China and the closing window of opportunity that Japan faced. Some argued that Japan should strike immediately before Chinese unity could solidify further. Others cautioned that a broader conflict would be costly and might end in disaster. But as the months passed and China continued to grow stronger, the arguments for immediate action became harder and harder to resist. Section 4. The invasion begins. By the summer of 1937, all four traps had reached their critical point at the same time, creating conditions where major conflict was almost inevitable, regardless of what any individual leader wanted. The resource trap meant Japan needed to expand or face gradual economic strangulation as its stockpiles depleted. The Manchuria trap meant Japan had to protect its enormous investment or lose everything it had poured into the region over 6 years. The military trap meant that officers on the ground could create incidents that Tokyo could not control, and the China trap meant that every month of delay allowed Japan's potential opponent to grow stronger and more unified. What happened next would demonstrate exactly how these pressures combined to produce catastrophe. A single incident at an ancient bridge outside Beijing would spiral into one of the most devastating conflicts in human history, claiming millions of lives and reshaping the entire Pacific region for generations to come. The soldiers and officers involved in the initial clash had no way of knowing what they were starting, but the forces that had been building for decades ensured that once begun, the conflict could not easily be stopped. To understand how this happened, we need to examine the events of that fateful summer in detail, because the sequence of decisions and accidents reveals exactly how the four traps operated in practice. On the night of July 7, 1937, Japanese troops from a garrison unit were conducting exercises near the Marco Polo Bridge, known to the Chinese as Geckokujo, an ancient stone structure that carried the main road from Beijing to the south. The bridge had stood for centuries, its stone lions gazing silently at travelers crossing the Yongding River. The famous explorer Marco Polo himself had seen and described an earlier version of this bridge during his travels through China, which is how it came to be known in the West. Now, this historic crossing was about to become the flashpoint for a conflict that would engulf two nations and ultimately draw in the entire world. Under treaties dating back to the Boxer Protocol of 1901, Japan had the right to station troops in certain areas around Beijing to protect its diplomatic facilities. A supplementary agreement from 1902 permitted these forces to conduct training exercises without informing the authorities of other nations in China. By 1937, Japanese forces in the region had grown to between 7,000 and 15,000 men, mostly positioned along the railways connecting Beijing with the port of Tianjin. Japanese commanders regularly conducted training exercises in the area, sometimes at night, which created ongoing tension between the two sides. The Chinese forces in the area belonged to the 29th Army, commanded by General Song Jae-yuan. This unit had a complex history, having originally been part of the Northwestern Army under Feng Yuqiang before being reorganized under nationalist control. The 29th Army was responsible for maintaining order in the region around Beijing, and its soldiers had clashed with Japanese troops on previous occasions. Both sides were nervous and watchful, aware that the political situation had changed dramatically since the Xi'an incident of December 1936. During the night exercises on July 7th, a Japanese soldier went missing, which set in motion a chain of events that neither side could stop. Japanese commanders demanded permission to enter the nearby walled town of Wanping to search for the missing man. The Chinese garrison commander, Wang Lengzhai, refused to allow foreign troops inside the walls without proper authorization from his superiors. Negotiations continued through the night, with both sides sending messages to their respective headquarters and trying to resolve the situation before it escalated further. Shortly before 5 in the morning on July 8, 1937, gunfire erupted near the bridge. The exact circumstances of how the shooting started remain unclear to this day. Each side blamed the other for firing first. What is certain is that the missing soldier had already returned to his unit by the time the fighting began, making the initial justification for entering Wanping irrelevant. By then, shots had been exchanged, and both sides were calling for reinforcements. Within minutes of Wang Lengzhai returning to Wanping, he witnessed Japanese troops massing around the town. The first shots of what would become a catastrophic conflict had been fired. Colonel Ji Xingwen led the Chinese defense with approximately 100 soldiers, under orders to hold the bridge at any cost. Fighting was fierce, with the Chinese taking heavy casualties but refusing to withdraw. Around 4 in the morning, reinforcements began arriving on both sides, and the Chinese rushed an additional division of troops to the area. Both governments attempted to negotiate a ceasefire even as the guns continued firing, but local commanders proved unable or unwilling to implement the truces that were announced. What made this incident different from previous clashes was that neither side was willing to back down, because the political situation had changed significantly since the Xi'an incident just 7 months earlier. Before December 1936, the Chinese central government had often avoided confrontation with Japan, preferring to focus on defeating internal rivals. Chiang Kai-shek had famously compared Japan to a disease of the skin while calling communism a disease of the heart, indicating his belief that the internal threat was more urgent than the external one. The Xi'an incident had forced Chiang to agree to a united front against foreign aggression. Chinese public opinion demanded resistance, and regional commanders, who had previously stayed neutral, were now aligned with Nanjing. By July 1937, practically all Chinese regional military and political groups had rallied to support the nationalist government in their decision to oppose Japan by every means available. The Communists, who had urged a united front since 1935, pledged their support and placed their armies nominally under government command. If the central government backed down at Marco Polo Bridge, it would lose the nationalist legitimacy that held this fragile coalition together. Stakes were too high for compromise. Japan faced similar pressures from the opposite direction. The culture of military insubordination that had developed over the previous decade made it almost impossible for Tokyo to order a withdrawal without appearing weak. Officers in the field expected support for their actions, and the government had consistently backed unauthorized operations in the past. Every previous incident had ended with Japan gaining territory or concessions. Retreating from Marco Polo Bridge would signal to every regional commander in China that Japanese resolve was weakening, potentially emboldening resistance everywhere. Despite attempts at negotiation, the situation around Beijing deteriorated rapidly in the weeks following the initial clash. On July 11th, the Japanese cabinet authorized the deployment of reinforcements from Japan itself, as well as additional units from the Kwantung Army in Manchuria. Cabinet's decision followed the Goso Conference, which approved sending an infantry division from the Korean garrison, 2 combined brigades from the Kwantung Army, and an air regiment composed of 18 squadrons to northern China. Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe initially hoped to contain the fighting to the Beijing-Tianjin area and avoid a wider conflict that might draw in Western powers. The Japanese government avoided declaring war, instead referring to the fighting as the North China Incident, and later the China Incident. This terminology was deliberate. A formal declaration of conflict might trigger American embargoes under the Neutrality Acts, cutting off the oil and steel supplies that Japan desperately needed. By the end of July 1937, Japanese forces had captured both Beijing and Tianjin, bringing all of northern China under threat and demonstrating that the conflict was already escalating beyond anyone's control. Chinese 29th Army, which had defended the Marco Polo Bridge area with such determination, was forced to withdraw after 24 days of combat. Japanese troops entered Beijing on July 29th and seized the vital port facilities at Tianjin the following day. The Taku forts, which guarded the approach to Tianjin, fell on July 30th. The speed of the advance seemed to confirm Japanese assumptions about Chinese military weakness, reinforcing the belief that a few sharp blows would bring China to terms. Remarkably, even as Japanese forces occupied northern China, foreign ministry officials in Tokyo opened negotiations with Chiang Kai-shek's government in Nanjing. The foreign minister publicly stated that Japan wanted Chinese cooperation, not Chinese territory. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the conflict might be contained or even resolved through diplomacy. Konoe government's initial plan was localized containment, limiting Japanese advances to the regions already under occupation while seeking a negotiated settlement. But these negotiations were undermined by events hundreds of miles to the south. On August 9, 1937, a Japanese naval officer named Isao Oyama and a seaman were eliminated in Shanghai while apparently attempting to enter a Chinese military airfield at Hongqiao. The exact circumstances remain disputed. Some historians suggest the officers were acting under orders to create an incident, while others believe they stumbled into a confrontation by accident. Whatever the truth, the incident gave Japanese naval commanders the justification they needed to demand action. Japanese consul general demanded that Chinese forces withdraw from Shanghai and dismantle their defensive positions. The Chinese refused, and both sides began rushing reinforcements to the city. Shanghai in 1937 was one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world, home to millions of Chinese residents along with substantial foreign communities in the international settlement and French concession. It was China's largest commercial center, its most important port, and a symbol of both Chinese modernization and foreign influence. Known as the Pearl of the Orient, Shanghai was the fifth largest city in the world at the time. What happened there over the next 3 months would shock observers around the world and transform the nature of the conflict. Unlike the fighting in the north, the Battle of Shanghai was not an accident or the result of a minor incident spiraling out of control. It was a deliberate decision by Chiang Kai-shek to demonstrate that China would fight. On August 15, 1937, Chiang issued an order of general mobilization and was appointed commanding chief of the Army, Navy, and Air Forces. For the first time since the fall of the Qing dynasty, China was committing its full national strength to resist foreign aggression. Chiang concentrated his best troops around Shanghai and launched an offensive that would demonstrate to the world that China could and would fight against superior forces. On August 13, 1937, Chiang's forces attacked Japanese marine positions in Shanghai with an initial force of 30,000 troops. These were the German-trained divisions that had been carefully prepared over the previous years, equipped with modern weapons and led by officers trained in contemporary tactics. General Zhang Zhizhong commanded the Chinese operations as the leader of the Fifth Army and the Nanjing-Shanghai war zone. Chiang positioned his best forces where the large foreign community could witness China's resistance, hoping to generate international sympathy and support. The Japanese naval landing force was heavily outnumbered, with only about 4,200 men facing the initial Chinese assault. The Chinese troops attacked with determination, driving the Japanese back into defensive positions and inflicting significant casualties. For the first time in years, Chinese forces were winning engagements against Japanese troops, and the news electrified the nation. Japanese commanders were shocked by the intensity of Chinese resistance and the effectiveness of their German training. On August 15th, the Japanese formed the Shanghai Expeditionary Army, composed of the 3rd and 11th Divisions under the command of General Iwane Matsui. 4 days later, Prime Minister Konoe announced that the Sino-Japanese conflict could only be resolved through armed force, regardless of any attempts at negotiation by third-party nations. The initial plan of localized containment had escalated to total confrontation, with the ultimate goal of forcing the Chinese government to fully cooperate with Japanese economic and political demands. On August 23, 1937, the Shanghai Expeditionary Army arrived by sea. On the same day, Japanese aircraft began a sustained campaign over Nanjing and various cities in central China. The battle transformed from a contained urban engagement into a massive military operation involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides. The fighting lasted for more than 3 months, from August 13th to November 26, 1937. Chinese forces defended with remarkable tenacity, contesting every street and building in some of the most intense urban combat the world had ever seen. The German advisors who had trained these divisions were present at the front lines, wearing Chinese uniforms and providing tactical guidance that surprised Japanese commanders. The Chinese Air Force, though vastly outnumbered, contested Japanese air superiority throughout the battle. In intense aerial engagements between August 14th and August 18th, Chinese pilots managed to destroy 2 entire Japanese squadrons. August 14th was later designated Air Force Day in China to commemorate these achievements. China was fighting with every aircraft it possessed, many of them purchased second-hand from various countries. Japan's robust aviation industry could easily replace its losses, while China could not manufacture replacement aircraft domestically. Despite this disadvantage, the Chinese Air Force continued fighting and received a crucial lifeline when Soviet aid began arriving under the new Sino-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, signed in September 1937. New fighter aircraft replaced the initial inventory of American-made planes that were gradually lost through attrition. Soviet technicians also arrived to upgrade Chinese transportation systems and train additional pilots. The battle can be divided into 3 stages, each revealing the determination of both sides and the terrible price being paid for every block of urban terrain. The first stage lasted from August 13th to August 22nd, during which the Chinese besieged the Japanese naval landing force in bloody urban fighting. The second stage lasted from August 23rd to October 26th as Japanese reinforcements landed and the 2 armies fought house to house in the Creek country north of Shanghai. The final stage, from late October to the end of November, involved the retreat of Chinese forces in the face of Japanese flanking maneuvers and combat along the road to Nanjing. On November 5, 1937, Japanese forces executed an amphibious landing at Hangzhou Bay, south of Shanghai, outflanking the Chinese defensive positions and threatening to trap the defending forces. Recognizing the danger of strategic encirclement, Chinese commanders ordered a withdrawal on November 12th. The battle was over, but it had demonstrated to the world and to Japan that China could and would fight. Chinese casualties during the Battle of Shanghai were staggering. German-trained divisions suffered losses of up to 60% of their strength. In one failed tank infantry counteroffensive alone, Chinese forces lost approximately 90 officers and 1,000 men. But Japanese losses were also severe, far higher than anticipated for what military planners had expected to be a quick operation. The battle proved that the conflict in China would not be the short, decisive campaign that some in Tokyo had imagined. With Shanghai secured, Japanese forces advanced southward toward Nanjing, the capital of the nationalist Chinese government. The exhausted Chinese army, having suffered catastrophic losses defending Shanghai, was in no condition to mount another prolonged defense. Chiang Kai-shek made the difficult decision to relocate his government westward, eventually settling in Chongqing, deep in the interior of Sichuan province where Japanese forces could not easily reach. Nanjing fell to Japanese forces in mid-December 1937, and what followed would become one of the most notorious episodes in the entire conflict. The Battle of Nanjing itself lasted from December 1st to December 13th, 1937. Chinese defenses crumbled quickly, with many soldiers attempting to flee across the Yangtze River rather than face the advancing Japanese forces. When the city fell, tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers were trapped within the walls, along with hundreds of thousands of civilians who had not been able to evacuate. Over a period of several weeks, Japanese troops committed widespread atrocities against both captured soldiers and the civilian population. International observers, including Western businessmen and missionaries who had remained in the city, documented systematic violence on a horrifying scale. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed, buildings were looted and burned, and thousands of women were subjected to brutal assault. The international press covered these events extensively, and the reports shocked audiences around the world. Estimates of the total number who perished during this period vary widely, with figures ranging from 100,000 to over 300,000. Most historians accept the findings of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, which estimated at least 200,000 lives lost and 20,000 women assaulted. The city itself was devastated, with more than a third of its buildings destroyed by fire and looting. General Matsui Iwane commanded the Japanese forces that captured Nanjing, and historical evidence indicates that the systematic nature of the atrocities reflected decisions made at command levels rather than spontaneous violence by undisciplined troops. This was not random violence, but systematic brutality that reflected the dehumanizing ideology that had permeated elements of the Japanese military establishment. Chinese civilians were viewed by some military leaders as inferior, unworthy of the protections normally extended to conquered populations. According to historical records, the ideology taught that the Chinese did not deserve the land they occupied, describing them in dehumanizing terms that stripped away their basic humanity. This ideology enabled acts that defied normal human conscience. Paradoxically, the tragedy at Nanjing increased international sympathy for China and strengthened Chinese resolve to continue resisting, exactly the opposite of what Japanese strategists had intended. American journalist Tilman Durden and photographer John McGee documented the atrocities, and their reports helped turn international opinion decisively against Japan. The events at Nanjing would later become central evidence in the Tokyo war crimes trials that followed Japan's defeat. Japanese planners had expected that capturing the Chinese capital would force Chiang Kai-shek to negotiate a settlement on Japanese terms. They believed that China's government would collapse or sue for peace once its major cities fell. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong, revealing a critical misunderstanding of Chinese politics and national sentiment. Instead of surrendering, the nationalist government moved westward and prepared for prolonged resistance. Chongqing, located at the western end of the Yangtze Gorges in Sichuan province, became the wartime capital. Much of China's educational, cultural, and political leadership migrated to the far west, to Sichuan and Yunnan provinces, carrying with them the determination to continue the struggle no matter how long it took. By the end of 1938, Japan had captured most of China's ports, the majority of its major cities as far west as Hankow, and the larger part of its railway network. Yet the Chinese had not yielded. Japan controlled the coastal regions and the major transportation routes, but its authority extended little beyond the cities and railway lines. In the vast countryside, Chinese resistance continued through guerrilla operations that ambushed supply columns and targeted isolated units. The Communist forces, reorganized as the 8th Route Army and New 4th Army under the United Front Agreement, proved particularly effective at this type of fighting, establishing base areas in northern and central China that Japanese forces could never fully suppress. Japan attempted to establish puppet governments in occupied China, but struggled to find Chinese who were willing to collaborate. Those who did accept positions in Japanese-backed administrations often had little real authority and were viewed as traitors by most of the population. The Japanese vision of a cooperative China that would accept its role in a new Asian order remained elusive despite years of military effort and enormous expenditure of resources. Foreign support began flowing to China from multiple directions. The Soviet Union provided the largest amount of foreign aid in the early years of the conflict, totaling approximately $250 million in credits for munitions and supplies. Soviet bombers, fighters, supplies, and advisors arrived in China, and Soviet technicians upgraded Chinese transportation systems. This aid was motivated partly by ideology, but primarily by Moscow's desire to keep Japan occupied in China rather than threatening Soviet territory in Siberia. The conflict that Japanese leaders had expected to last weeks or months had transformed into an endless quagmire that consumed resources Japan could not spare. Section 5. The consequences. The 1937 invasion of China produced consequences that its planners never anticipated and could not control. What began as an attempt to solve Japan's economic and strategic problems instead created new pressures that would eventually lead the country into confrontation with the Western powers and ultimately to total defeat. Understanding these consequences helps explain how a localized conflict at an ancient bridge became part of a global catastrophe that reshaped the entire world order. The Second Sino-Japanese conflict was one of the most destructive episodes of the 20th century, claiming millions of lives on both sides and devastating an entire continent. The scale of destruction was almost incomprehensible, comparable in its impact to the Eastern Front in Europe. With half of China ruined by years of continuous fighting, the human suffering defied simple quantification. Estimates of Chinese casualties vary widely depending on the methodology used, but the most commonly accepted figures suggest between 15 and 20 million Chinese civilians and military personnel perished between 1937 and 1945. In fact, British historian Mark Felton has argued that across all of Japanese-occupied Asia, up to 30 million civilians lost their lives, a figure he notes is far greater in sheer numbers than the Nazi Holocaust. The suffering extended beyond direct casualties to include millions displaced from their homes, families torn apart by the fighting, and communities destroyed by the conflict. This represented approximately half of all casualties in the entire Pacific theater of the Second World Conflict, demonstrating the unprecedented scale of destruction that China endured. Indeed, the human cost was staggering. According to Oxford historian Rana Mitter, author of Forgotten Ally, China's World War II, conservative estimates place Chinese deaths between 14 and 20 million people over the course of the conflict. This figure represented roughly half of all casualties in the entire Pacific theater of the Second World War. Fighting produced between 80 and 100 million refugees as families fled from one province to the next, trying to stay ahead of the advancing Japanese forces. Japanese forces also suffered heavily, with approximately 480,000 soldiers losing their lives on Chinese soil during the 8 years of fighting. This represented a massive drain on Japanese manpower that weakened the country's ability to fight on other fronts. The conflict in China consumed troops, equipment, and supplies that might otherwise have been available for operations elsewhere in Asia and the Pacific. Beyond the immediate casualties, the conflict devastated China's economy and infrastructure in ways that would take decades to repair. Cities were destroyed, farmland was abandoned, and transportation networks were shattered. Industrial facilities were either captured by Japanese forces or deliberately destroyed to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The recovery from this destruction would shape China's development well into the second half of the 20th century. Meanwhile, from a strategic perspective, the invasion of China created exactly the situation that Japanese planners had hoped to avoid. Instead of securing resources and stabilizing the region, it locked Japan into a draining conflict with no clear path to victory. The ongoing operations in China consumed enormous quantities of the very resources that Japan had gone there to gain in the first place. Every division stationed in China was a division unavailable for other operations. Every ship carrying supplies up the Yangtze was a ship unavailable for Pacific operations. Every aircraft patrolling Chinese skies was an aircraft not defending the home islands. The conflict became a net drain on Japanese resources, continuously consuming military personnel, industrial production, and financial reserves that could have supported operations elsewhere. Even before American entry into the broader conflict, the operations in China forced Japan to ration essential civilian commodities. Rice, fuel, and other vital goods were restricted within Japan itself by the early 1940s. The industrial expansion that was supposed to flow from Chinese resources instead required constant infusions of men and material that Japan could barely afford. The more Japan invested in the Chinese theater, the more it needed to invest to protect what had already been committed. This sunk cost dynamic made it psychologically impossible to withdraw even when the strategic situation clearly favored doing so. The longer the conflict continued, the more dependent Japan became on imported resources from countries that were increasingly hostile to Japanese expansion. American oil and scrap metal kept the Japanese military machine running, but the United States was growing more sympathetic to China with each passing month. Brutality documented at Nanjing and elsewhere had turned American public opinion decisively against Japan, creating political pressure for economic measures that would eventually strangle the Japanese economy. President Roosevelt, who had initially hoped to avoid confrontation in Asia, found his options narrowing as Japanese actions alienated American opinion. The invasion of China set Japan on a collision course with the Western powers that would ultimately prove fatal. In July 1939, the United States announced that it would terminate its commercial treaty with Japan, a warning shot that indicated Washington's growing displeasure with Japanese actions in Asia. The following year, America began restricting exports of aviation fuel and scrap iron, the very materials that Japan's military machine depended upon. By July 1941, the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands had frozen Japanese assets and imposed a complete embargo on oil exports to Japan. The resource trap that had pushed Japan toward expansion in 1937 now threatened to strangle the country entirely. Japanese leaders faced a terrible choice. They could withdraw from China and accept the humiliation of abandoning years of investment and hundreds of thousands of lives sacrificed, or they could expand the conflict even further, seizing the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and the rubber plantations of British Malaya to achieve the self-sufficiency that had always been the goal. The latter option meant armed confrontation with the Western powers, including the United States. Meanwhile, Japan chose expansion. On December 7, 1941, Japanese forces struck the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, hoping that a devastating blow would convince the United States to accept Japanese dominance in Asia. Instead, it unified American opinion behind total opposition and began a conflict that Japan could not possibly sustain. The decision to invade China in 1937 had set in motion a chain of events that led directly to this moment. As the conflict dragged on year after year, the pattern of Japanese occupation and Chinese resistance became increasingly fixed. Japan held the cities and the transportation corridors, while Chinese forces controlled much of the countryside and waged continuous guerrilla operations against Japanese positions. Neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough that would end the stalemate. The Japanese conducted sustained air campaigns against Chinese cities, particularly targeting Chongqing, the wartime capital. The sustained raids on Chongqing, which began in February 1938 and continued until August 1943, caused tens of thousands of civilian casualties and massive destruction. Yet despite the devastation, the city remained defiant, and the nationalist government stayed operational throughout the ordeal. The failure to break Chinese morale through aerial devastation demonstrated the limits of Japanese air power. Chinese forces achieved several significant defensive victories during this period, proving that they could hold important positions when properly prepared and motivated. The Battle of Changde in late 1943 saw Japanese forces attempt to capture the strategically important city, only to face fierce resistance and eventual counterattacks that allowed Chinese forces to retake the position. Similarly, the Battle of West Hunan in 1945 demonstrated that Chinese forces, bolstered by American supplies and air support, could inflict heavy casualties on Japanese units and halt their advances. These victories, though often overshadowed by events in other theaters, showed that Chinese resistance remained effective even after years of continuous fighting. By 1944, the strategic situation had shifted decisively against Japan. American forces were advancing across the Pacific, and the Japanese home islands faced increasing danger from long-range aerial operations. In response, Japan launched Operation Ichigo, a massive offensive intended to secure overland transportation routes through China and eliminate American air bases that threatened Japanese positions. The operation achieved tactical successes but failed to change the strategic reality. Japan was losing the broader conflict and could not sustain its position in China indefinitely. Despite the catastrophic losses, the conflict paradoxically strengthened China's international position in ways that would have seemed impossible in 1937. The United States increasingly recognized China as a strategic ally against Japan, and American support increased dramatically after Pearl Harbor brought America into the broader conflict through programs like Lend-Lease. In 1943, the United States took steps that acknowledged China's emergence as a major power, abolishing discriminatory immigration laws and ending the extraterritorial rights that had symbolized Western privilege in China for nearly a century. At the Cairo Conference in November 1943, Chiang Kai-shek met with President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill as an equal partner. The three leaders agreed that Taiwan and Manchuria would be returned to China after Japan's defeat, recognizing Chinese sovereignty over territories that Japan had controlled for decades. This was a dramatic reversal from the pre-conflict period when China had been treated as a weak nation, subject to foreign interference and unequal treaties. The conflict also transformed China's internal politics in ways that would shape the nation's future for decades to come. The Communist Party, which had been nearly destroyed during Chiang's elimination campaigns of the early 1930s, used the period of armed resistance to rebuild its strength and expand its influence. Communist forces adapted to changing wartime conditions and became a seasoned fighting force through years of guerrilla operations against Japanese occupation. Mao Zedong, operating from his base in Yan'an, used the conflict period to consolidate his authority within the communist movement and prepare for an eventual seizure of power. In 1940, he outlined the program of the Chinese Communists for an eventual transition of power and began his final push for consolidation of party authority. His teachings became the central tenets of Communist Party doctrine. Party membership grew from approximately 100,000 in 1937 to 1.2 million by 1945, positioning the Communists for post-conflict dominance. The Second Sino-Japanese conflict ended on September 2, 1945, with Japan's formal surrender following the atomic devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet declaration of hostilities against Japan in Manchuria. Soviet forces swept through Manchuria in a matter of days, ending Japanese control over the territory that had been the original justification for so much of the conflict. After 8 years of continuous fighting, China had survived as a nation, though at a terrible cost. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, convened in Tokyo between 1946 and 1948, brought charges against Japanese military and political leaders for their roles in the conflict. General Matsui Iwane, who had commanded the forces that captured Nanjing, was among those found guilty and sentenced to face consequences for his role in the atrocities. The tribunal established a historical record of Japanese conduct during the conflict, though debates about responsibility and interpretation continue to this day. The conflict left scars that have never fully healed, shaping relations between Japan and China down to the present day and influencing politics throughout East Asia. For China, The experience of the conflict reinforced a determination never again to be vulnerable to foreign aggression. A century of humiliation, which began with the Opium Wars and continued through Japanese occupation, became a central narrative in Chinese national identity. This historical memory continues to influence Chinese foreign policy and public opinion, particularly in relations with Japan. Disputes over historical interpretation, textbook content, and official commemorations remain sources of tension between the two countries. For Japan, the conflict and its aftermath forced a reconsideration of national identity and international relations. The post-war constitution renounced armed aggression as an instrument of national policy, and Japan's economic development took priority over military expansion. The country rebuilt itself as an economic power rather than a military one, achieving remarkable prosperity in the decades following defeat. However, debates about historical responsibility, constitutional revision, and Japan's regional role continue to divide Japanese society and shape its politics. The question of how to remember and teach the history of 1937 to 1945 remains politically charged in Japan, with different groups advocating different interpretations. Conflict also demonstrated the limits of military force as a tool for achieving national objectives. Japan's armed forces were among the most capable in the world in 1937, yet they could not compel Chinese surrender or establish lasting control over occupied territory. The combination of Chinese determination, foreign support, and the vastness of the Chinese theater frustrated Japanese strategy at every turn. This lesson that military superiority alone cannot guarantee political success would be relearned by other powers in other conflicts throughout the 20th century. The four traps that drove Japan to invade China in 1937 ultimately destroyed the very empire they were meant to preserve. The resource trap led Japan to seek territories that it could not hold and conflicts it could not sustain. The Manchuria trap locked Japan into defending investments that never produced the expected returns. The military trap allowed officers in the field to create crises that civilian leaders could not control. And the China trap convinced Japanese strategists that they had to act before their window of opportunity closed, driving them into a conflict they fundamentally misunderstood. Japan did not choose to invade China in 1937 in any simple sense. The decision emerged from decades of previous choices, each one narrowing the range of options available until armed conflict seemed like the only remaining path. The tragedy is that different choices at various points might have led to different outcomes, but once the four traps had closed, escape became nearly impossible. The conflict that began at Marco Polo Bridge became one of the bloodiest in human history. It destroyed Japan's empire and transformed China's place in the world. Its consequences are still being felt today in the territorial disputes and historical controversies that continue to shape relations between East Asian nations. Looking back across the sweep of events from 1937 to 1945, we can see how a minor clash at an ancient bridge became the trigger for catastrophe, not because of what happened that night, but because of all the pressures that had been building for decades beforehand. The soldier who went missing during night exercises, the shots fired before dawn, the demands for entry into Wanping, none of these alone would have been sufficient to start a conflict that claimed millions of lives. Combined with the four traps that had been closing around Japan for years, they ignited a conflagration that neither side could control. Understanding these pressures helps explain not just why Japan invaded China, but why conflicts throughout history so often spiral beyond the control of those who start them. Nations make decisions that seem rational in the moment, only to find themselves trapped by the consequences of their previous choices. The lesson of 1937 is that some paths, once taken, cannot easily be reversed, and that the costs of aggression often fall most heavily on those who choose it. However, this raises another question entirely. If Japan's military leadership made such devastating miscalculations in 1937, what other strategic errors led to their ultimate defeat? To discover how a single battle exposed the fatal weaknesses in Japan's war machine, check out our video on why Japan's forces collapsed almost instantly at Midway. Or, if you want to understand how the invasion of China led directly to the attack that brought America into the conflict, watch our documentary on why Japan had to attack Pearl Harbor to see how the 4 traps we discussed today made that fateful decision almost inevitable.